Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be back in what may be my favorite venue in what may be my favorite city. Although I'm from New Orleans, so I'm sort of tied, sister cities, New Orleans and San Francisco. But I come here every time I have a book out because I really do feel at home at the JCC here. And over the years, as I've written these books, I began to notice a pattern. It's one of the things that old Leonardo was able to do, is he looked across disciplines and noticed a pattern. I had started with Henry Kissinger, and after I finished that book, I thought, I want to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years, so I don't have to deal with them again. But it was also, I thought, okay, Kissinger did a realist balance of power, sort of a brilliant form of amoral realism. And who was the first person who sort of invented realist foreign policy for the United States? I realized Ben Franklin had done this balance of power game when he was over in France. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. People don't think of him as a diplomat. They think of him as a writer. And then as I was doing him, I realized he was a scientist as well. We think of him as a doddering old dude flying a kite in the rain. But those electricity experiments were the most important experiments of the time. So the pattern I began to notice is that I liked people who connected arts to science. In fact, it seemed to me that it wasn't just being smart that mattered, because if you've been to these lectures, you've probably met a whole lot of smart people, and you realize they don't generally amount to much. What matters is being creative, being imaginative, being innovative, thinking out of the box. And so I did Einstein because, like Benjamin Franklin, he loved connecting art to science. Whenever he had trouble with general relativity equations, he'd pull out his violin and play Mozart because he said it helped connect him to the harmonies of the spheres. And I just thought that was such a beautiful concept, that the equations of the universe and the notes of music both have a harmony to them that are connected. After doing Franklin and Einstein, I got a call from Steve Jobs. He said, do me next. I said, yeah, sure. Franklin, Einstein, you, he was my age. And I said, I'll do you in 30 years when you retire. It was only a little bit later that word came back that if you're going to do Steve, you got to do him now. And I realized, too, that he was somebody who ended all of his product presentations with a slide over his shoulder showing the arts intersecting with technology. It was 2 street signs. And he said, at that intersection is where creativity occurs. And so between him and then Bill Gates, who had bought the notebook of Leonardo da Vinci, known as the Codex Leicester, which is one of his best science notebooks, I realized that the culmination of this series really had to be somebody I'd been interested in my whole life, ever since I was a young kid hitchhiking through Europe. And not only go to see the Mona Lisa, but you stumble across his notebooks, which were on display in Milan, or there were some in Paris. And then Bill Gates bought the Codex Leicester. And I realized that it would be great, instead of doing a book that was just about his painting, to do a book that was about him. Because he believed strongly that he wasn't just a painter, that he was somebody who did art, engineering, and science, and made very little distinction between the different disciplines. Nowadays, we, in our universities, have silos. In our life, we specialize. We make our kids, figure out, okay, how you're going to be specialists in something. But you realize that it's the truly creative people who let their minds dance across so many disciplines. And that's what fascinated me when I was reading Leonardo's notebook. Leonardo had the great good fortune to be born out of wedlock. He was born in this tiny town of Vinci, baptized at that church. Had he been born legitimate, he would have had to be a notary like his father, and his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, because that's the way things worked then. And one thing I knew about Leonardo from the very beginning was he would have been a terrible notary. He really loved to think out of the box and creatively, wasn't good at sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Sometimes he'd leave things unfinished. But the other good thing about being born out of wedlock was that he was not sent to one of the Latin schools, they were called, the classical schools teaching the rebirth of classical wisdom, or one of the universities, because as an illegitimate son, he wasn't eligible to go. So he had to teach himself. He made himself what he called a disciple of experience. And the very first lesson about Leonardo, as we said, it was said just a few minutes ago, is he had more curiosity than any other person in history. And I think it was partly because as a very young kid playing in the streams around Vinci that flow into the Arno and making his little things, he did so many experiments and had so many experiences, he used the word experientia for both, because he wanted to teach himself. And he started making lists of all the things he needed to know. Like, why is the sky blue? Why do people yawn? How do they walk on ice up in the Netherlands and places where it gets cold? Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. That's the one that really got me when I saw that one. Who would wake up one morning and decide they needed to know what the tongue of a woodpecker looks like? How would you even find out? Find a woodpecker and open its mouth? But that's Leonardo. He just wanted to know everything that could possibly be known about everything that could be known about our universe, including how we fit in. His father finally, at age 12, brings him to Florence, where his father actually had his notary shop, and it's also very fortunate for him, because Florence was a cradle of creativity in 1470. In fact, both in this book and in the book I did on Steve Jobs, I compare Florence of 1470 to the San Francisco Bay Area 500 years later in 1970. In 1970, here in the Bay Area, you had so many people of diverse types of interest, whether the free speech movement and the hippies and the electric Kool-Aid acid test types, as well as the homebrew computer club and the people from Intel and others who were inventing the microchip, and they all sort of come together in the valley and up here in the Bay Area. And they do so in an era and an atmosphere of enormous tolerance. You have that for a while in Florence 500 years ago. It's where different sorts of people suddenly came because there was a new rising middle class, based on the fact that the Medici and other bankers had invented things like debit and credit bookkeeping that allowed them to sort of do all sorts of new types of financing, almost like Sand Hill Road, but it was the Biagorzo down in Florence where they were doing it. And they were able to bring together architects and artists, other types of artisans, along with jewelry makers and people who were just making regular cloth, and chemists, and people who were financing, and people who were building huge new palaces in Florence, so that suddenly you were making new types of cloth, new types of art, new types of silk weaving and everything. So it becomes a fount of creativity. And it's a fount of creativity with engineering as well. When Leonardo first gets there, he's working for Verrocchio's studio. That's the Duomo. Brunelleschi has just figured out how to put the most amazing dome on it, but also do the engineering. It was more a feat of engineering than of art. And Leonardo in his shop, or Verrocchio in his shop, with a 12-year-old Leonardo there, gets to put the copper ball on top. 30 years later in the notebooks, Leonardo's still saying, remember how we made concave mirrors to focus the rays of the sun, to weld together the copper ball and hoist it to the top of the cathedral. So there he is, learning engineering and everything else, truly enjoying himself. And we even know what a wonderful kid he was at 12. This is when he first comes to the studio at Verrocchio. Verrocchio's shop does a statue of David. That's what you did. You either did Madonna or David. You sort of churned them out. And what we have here is a sketch by one of the other apprentices in the shop of Leonardo posing for David. And this here is something from, I'll show you later, Leonardo's, one of his first paintings, where in the lower right-hand corner, the artist would always put a little sketch of themselves looking away from the rest of the scene, sort of being the commentator. And so you can see the face, the sort of chin, the beautiful curly hair, that blonde curly hair that falls down, that Leonardo sported. The main thing Leonardo did as a young kid, an apprentice in Florence, was do pageants and plays. This is something else that other biographers hadn't really focused on, I don't think, but in the notebooks, you just see all of these drawings because they didn't have TV, they didn't have movies back then. In the evenings, the Medici would put on, a great performance, an outdoor spectacle, maybe a play in the palace or some discussion, debates like you would have here on this stage. This is his first known drawing. Everybody says, okay, why was he drawing that? Well, Verrocchio does this. It's because the Duke of Milan was coming and they were putting on a pageant, and the contract that Verrocchio's studio got was to do the costumes for the pageant, welcoming the Duke of Milan. There's Leonardo dealing with his fantasies, dragons and lions roaring, and the craggy old warrior that he loved so much, especially the curls and spirals, which was the pattern of nature he loved the most. This is famous, Leonardo, he invented the helicopter, didn't he? Not quite. This helicopter I discovered, when you look at it in context in the notebooks, it was another stage prop. They were doing a play called Danae, and the angels had to come down from the rafters, and Leonardo built the aerial screw that would bring them down for the rafters. But another lesson from Leonardo is indulge mystery and fantasy. Daydream a bit. Because by indulging fantasy, he ends up deciding, okay, I want to build real flying machines. I want to see if we can have man-made flying machines. So what starts off as a prop for the theater becomes a basis for a lifelong fascination on the study of birds and the question of whether he can build flying machines. Once again, we see his curiosity, too. On the birds, there's a wonderful notebook called Codex on the Flight of Birds. If it ever comes to display here, you should see it. But he asks himself all those questions, like describe the tongue of the woodpecker. But this is, does a bird raise its wing faster or lower it faster when it's taking off in flight? Now, the thing that struck me about that was it wasn't like Einstein asking, how do we find a tensor calculus that will describe the curvature of space-time? Something you and I are never going to do. But we could all pause for a moment and figure out, do birds flap up or down faster? It's a type of observation that Leonardo kept doing in his notebooks that makes him such a curious, observant person. Like the wings of the dragonfly. He said, go to the moat around the castle at night. Look at the four-winged dragonflies and see if the wings alternate or whether they flap up, go up and down in unison. So these are the type of things he's pushing himself willfully to learn. And by studying this, I started doing things like I'd see a bird take off, and I'd say, hey, do the wings go up faster or down? And like Leonardo, you discover it's different. For different, a pigeon is different from a eagle or some other bird. But you become, just by reading about Leonardo, more observant. Not just because it's useful to be more observant, but after a while, Leonardo's doing this not just to build flying machines, but because he wants to know. The curiosity for its own sake. The tongue of the woodpecker is not going to help him build a flying machine better or do the flight of birds better or do a painting better. But he wanted to know because he was Leonardo. And he always, felt there were questions to ask and really cool things to observe. The first painting he does in Verrocchio's studio, or helps do, and one of the other things I learned, some of you may remember I wrote a book called The Innovators, which is, we biographers have a dirty little secret. We kind of make it sound like innovation happens when some guy or gal goes to a garage or garret all alone and boom, innovation happened. And the way it really works, as anybody who's been from Intel to Apple to wherever, is that it's collaborative. That creativity is a team sport. And I discovered that most of the paintings put out by Verrocchio's studio were done collaboratively. And so Leonardo in this one, the Baptism of Christ, gets to paint this angel and the River Jordan coming through and the water of the River Jordan flowing to the ankles of Jesus. And once again, that pattern of flowing water and the swirls of flowing water is what he sorts, it sort of becomes the theme of the picture. The beautiful curls on his angel who's turning. I mean, it's androgynous almost, you forget it's a he, has just landed but has the beautiful curls turning the neck. And the angel that Verrocchio has painted next to it, the only emotion on his face is, how did I get here next to this amazing angel who's so much more beautiful? We know from a contemporary, who probably exaggerated a bit, that after this painting and seeing this angel, Verrocchio threw down his brush and said, I'll never paint again. I'll have Leonardo do all of the painting. But even the ripples around the ankles of Jesus, you see, are so scientifically accurate as the water ripples past. The very first portrait he does on his own also has the same theme. How do we connect with the earth around us? And it's through the flows of water that flow into the veins. It's as if the flow of nature connects us, and so the flow of the rivers and the curls end up being part of our body. This is Jenever De Benjy, which is the only one in a museum in North America at the National Gallery in Washington. It has some very similarities to the great last painting that Leonardo had by his deathbed, the Mona Lisa. It's a cloth merchant, silk merchant's wife in Florence, just like Lisa. 3/4 profile. Strange sort of emotions going on. You can't quite figure out what she's thinking. Smile's not so great, but he's trying hard to do an elusive smile there. And of course, there's the ringlets of curls that are his signature. This is not in any way the Mona Lisa, but it is clearly the work of the person who will go on to paint the Mona Lisa. And one of the theories I have in the book is, unlike Kenneth Clark and some of the art critics who criticize Leonardo for wasting his time, distracting himself by doing geology and fossils and flows of rivers and hydraulics and flight and mathematics and optics and anatomy and dissections, saying if he hadn't wasted his time doing all that, he could have painted more paintings. But if you look at the difference of Jenever De Benjy and then a lifetime spent being curious about all the patterns of everything in nature, you see how Jenever De Benjy turns into Mona Lisa. One of the things he does is not finish painting sometimes. The Adoration of the Magi, we see the swirls again, how wonderful he loves those swirls. And what he's doing here is something new, which is this is not just a moment. He's painting a narrative, because he has written that time is just like a river. It keeps flowing. There's no such thing as a single instant, because every instant is connected to what happened before and what happened after it. And it's like a play, too. It's like a dramatic stage narrative on a tilted stage. So the second king offering the gift, the first king who's a moment ago given the gift is now bowing down. Joseph is like, what's happening here? And, people slapping their heads. And so in the spiral, you see not just one moment, but the reactions. And it becomes very complicated, the reactions. And even this shadows, because Leonardo is very interested in shadows, but he knows that any object casts a little glow into a shadow. So he's trying to get all this right, and it just becomes too overwhelming, and he puts it aside. By the way, that's a figure I showed you earlier of the artist putting himself right there. So he does not finish this painting. This is uncool because his father, the notary, had notarized the contract saying you're going to finish this painting. And same with St. Jerome, notarize this one. He doesn't finish it. Any of you who have had, 20-something kids who are 20-something, and you've helped them get a commission or a job, and they don't deliver it, you can kind of imagine what Father Da Vinci and Leonardo were going through at his late 20s. We discover recently, and I do in my book something very interesting, about why he doesn't finish paintings. And I think he's a bit like Steve Jobs holding up the original Macintosh because the circuit board inside isn't beautiful enough. I think it's because he always feels he can make it better. He can make it more perfect. So he holds on to paintings. It's not like he just gives up on them, but holds on. And the way we know this is if you look at the neck muscles of St. Jerome, they're exactly anatomically right. They cross like two neck muscles do. This is done when he's very young, in his 20s, and he hasn't yet done anatomical drawings. In fact, some of the sketches he does at the time have the neck muscles wrong. And yet, why are they right here in this painting? We finally can discover through infrared and ultraviolet and other analysis that there's a painting that he originally did where he had it wrong. It's only after he does, here's some of his anatomy drawings, that he does 20 years later where he dissects human bodies to get all the muscles and nerves right. After 20 years he's doing this, and he goes back and finds this painting and repaints this part of it to have it right. So it's not so much that he gives up. It's that he always knows that I can put it aside because I'm having trouble with it, but someday I'll figure out a way to perfect it. And at this point in his life, in his late 20s, he does something wonderful, which is really start keeping these notebooks. I've just picked a page at random. Paper was a little bit expensive then, and so the cool thing is he crams all he can on any sheet of paper. And you see the craggy old warrior with the curls that he likes so much, but the connection between nature's patterns and the human pattern, like I said, the river flowing in the veins, he had discovered what now is called Leonardo's law of branching, which is that a tree like this, when it branches, the area of each branch and the circle of each branch totals up to the area of the trunk from which it branched. And this is also true of the blood and arteries in a human system. So he's almost showing, once again, nature, us being connected to nature in this way, doing the sort of mountains that come out of here, but also the mathematics of mountains. And he's trying over here and other places, beginning of his sort of notebook career, to do a problem that's called squaring the circle, which we think of as a cliche, but it was an ancient math problem, still a math challenge, which is how do you create a square that is the exact same area as a circle using just a protractor and a ruler. This is very difficult because pi is an irrational number. There are reasons that you can go look on Wikipedia under squaring the circle, see how complicated it is. But on page after page, we have Leonardo trying different ways to do what's called a lune, which helps you do a shaded area, that's the same as this, finding areas that can be transformed into other shapes and keep the same area. And even his optics experiments is how light hits curved objects and the type of shade they do. And then over and over again, we see him looking at spirals and curls of flowing water, spinning air, and then little curls of hair, because that's the pattern he loves. These are, again, the to-do lists, all the wonderful things that he has to figure out. But the cool thing is right at the bottom of this page, he describes how you can take certain types of nuts and the husks of nuts, boil them in oil, and it makes what he calls tawny, sort of blonde, hair dye that you can put in your hair. And all of a sudden I say, man, this is cool, this is personal. There's a guy turning 30, having problems with his father, not finishing his commissions, and worrying about going gray. So cool that you can see things like that. As I said, he was gay, and unlike Michelangelo, had no particular problem with it. And around this time, he has his first major companion, Salai, which is a nickname meaning the little devil. The curls, because Salai kept stealing things and nicking things, but as you can tell from the chalk drawings, Leonardo liked him. And we see over and over again, Salai, every doodle in the notebook, there's the curls in which Leonardo luxuriated, according to one contemporary, Salai's curls, and so he's all over the notebooks. But at this point, for the many reasons you may have guessed, and he also gets arrested for sodomy. Fortunately, among the other people arrested is a member of the Medici family, so even though it happens twice, the charges are dismissed. But even in tolerant Florence with a tolerant father, who at that point has now had a legitimate son, and so he's got this son who can't finish the paintings, who's been whatever, and Leonardo decides it's time to get out of here. So Leonardo leaves Florence and goes to Milan. He does it as part of a cultural delegation. Florence was not a great military power, and its influence came, as we in America sometimes have done in our better days, be it Louis Armstrong or anything else, through our cultural diplomacy, the movies, the music, the artists, the architects that we send around the world, and people, appreciate America's culture, its beauty, its values. Leonardo gets sent as part of a cultural delegation in 1482 to Milan. It's led by a poet and playwright, but it's also got artists and others. Leonardo actually goes as a musician because he has invented a new type of musical instrument, one of 20 he'll end up inventing in his notebooks. It's called lyra da braccia, which had already been invented, but a lyre for the arm like a violin. But he did it in the shape of a lion's head and was all in silver. And so he goes up to Milan and decides, I'm not sure I want to get back to Florence at the moment. Things are not going that well there. His paintings haven't been finished. He's looking for new horizons. He writes the most amazing job application letter in history. It's the way I begin the book, and I go back to it all. It's 11 paragraphs to the Duke of Milan. The first 10 paragraphs are all about engineering. I can make weapons of war, he says. I can build wonderful public buildings. I know how to divert the course of rivers, make new estuaries. I know how to, over and over again, make machinery that will, topple different types of fortresses. It's only in the 11th paragraph, the last one, he says, I can also paint. And indeed, he goes on there to paint the Last Supper and then the Mona Lisa. But at this point in his life, he's saying, I've got to be more than a painter. I have to be able to do everything. I have to know the beauty of engineering, the beauty of anatomy, the beauty of science, as well as painting. And he holds himself out to be that, and really among the first things he does is get a commission or be part of a competition to help put a Tiburio, a lantern tower, on top of Milan's cathedral. Once again, I'm struck as I go through this thing about collaboration. Because, other books make it seem like Leonardo's this loner. No, he has all sorts of friends, especially in the court of Milan. He's got Luca Pacioli, the great mathematician, Donato Bramante, the great architect. They're all friends. They call each other best friends. They have nicknames for each other. They're always hanging around in the evenings and doing things together. And so the greatest drawing ever done, Vitruvian Man, the guy in the circle in the square, I'm going to tell you the tale of how it was done as a piece of collaboration for different reasons. They're trying to build this Tiburio. Leonardo believes that simplicity is the ultimate beauty. As you may notice, this is not simple. It is a grotesque Gothic monstrosity. And Leonardo and his friends design a lantern tower, Tiburio, that's a very simple square design with a circle in it. Sort of the circle of the lantern tower and then square around it. You may notice from what I'm pointing out, they didn't build it. They decide they have to go with the Gothic style of the cathedral, and Leonardo is disappointed. They don't pick the design that he and some of his friends have worked on. And the main friend he's worked with is the architect and artist Donato Bramante. And this is a painting, one that Bramante actually did. And it is Bramante painting himself in one of his books, round face, balding, we know of Bramante. And he paints his friend, Leonardo da Vinci. We definitely know it's Leonardo. There's no question about it. But one thing to notice is he got the notebooks, and Leonardo wrote from right to left, backwards on notebooks in mirror script, because he was left-handed and didn't want to smudge the ink. and it was also a personal quirk. So even the notebook here is Leonardo's, with the mirror script. He's wearing the purple and pink short robes that he's so famous for wearing, has the luxurious curls of hair. And so these are these two best friends. And they decide to do church designs together. And one of the things that they particularly like is symmetrical churches, churches that are beautiful and have the proportions that are simple and keep the symmetry this way as opposed to the Gothic. And yes, let me make sure. So Leonardo and Bramante and their friends, there's a new book, an old book that's been newly discovered at that time. The Renaissance started with the rediscovery of classical books, like, if you've read The Swerve by Greenblatt, it talks about that. And one of them is Vitruvius, the 10 Books of Architecture. It talks about the exact proportions of a man, sorry. And Leonardo does dozens and dozens of drawings, getting the proportions of a human exactly right, moving and straight, because he wants to have the proportions and know scientifically what's right. He's still become obsessed with squaring the circle. There must be 500 different drawings like this for 40 years in his notebook of different ways to try to get a square the same shape as a circle. And they all go down to Pavia, the town not too far from Florence, where they're building a cathedral, a smaller cathedral, that's the way they like it. It isn't Gothic, it has symmetrical proportions, and as they find the Vitruvius book that's in the castle in Pavia, in the library, they all decide to draw Vitruvian Man. This is something people don't know, that there were other drawings of this at the same time. So you have Francesco di Giorgio, an architect who is on the trip to Pavia. Here's how he does it: circles, squares, proportions of a church. Giacomo Andrea, this is his drawing right there. Very simple. The great thing about Giacomo Andrea is we know exactly when they were doing this because he has a dinner right when they come back from Pavia. It's in his notebook, Leonardo's notebook, that at Giacomo Andrea, they all are at dinner, and Leonardo brings young Salai as his companion, who, being the little devil, breaks a plate and spills red wine at the dinner while these people are trying to conquer Vitruvian Man. And then Leonardo, his drawing, totally different. It is a work of exactitude in science. Every proportion is done perfectly. Even the foot is turned. The only awkward thing in the drawing is his foot being turned. And that's to show 1 foot level. It's sort of the measurements that are being used. He also understands Vitruvius, who had said that the navel has to be at the center of the circle, but that the genitals are the center of the square. And so what he does, since he understands the concept of squaring the circle, is he figures out, oh yeah, start them both down below, but let the circle go a little bit higher. You do Vitruvius, you keep the same area. So it's mathematically, as well as scientifically, as well as anatomically brilliant. It is also a work of unnecessary beauty. I actually got to see it. If you go to Venice, it's not on display. It's at the Academy. It's on the 4th floor. They keep it in a closet because if it's exposed to light too much, not cool. It fades. So you can talk your way into it if you pull a few, make a whole lot of phone calls. They'll bring it out. So they bring it out, and I'm sitting there alone with it, looking at it. If you get the book, it's the author picture. It's me staring at this thing. And you see the sharp incision. He knew exactly how to do the square. You see the incision into the paper. You see where he put his protractor point. And there's almost a chill that came over me, feeling the hand of the master doing this. And then finally, besides all these things, it's a work of totally unnecessary beauty. You look at what his friends are doing, they're doing stupid little stick figures. Leonardo, like I tried to do in the book with the high quality paper and stuff, it's like, make it as beautiful as possible. So the left-handed hatchings, the shadings, everything there, all these things you don't really need to get Vitruvian proportions right. And then look at that face, that curling hair, that jaw. And go back to this, and you realize that's Leonardo himself, doing a self-portrait, standing there in the earth and in the universe, spread eagle, saying, how do I fit in? So it's a work of him fitting into the universe, fitting into what we do on earth, the connection of us to the earth, but also the spiritual connection that comes when you design a church. Goes on in Milan to do many dissections, and among the things he invents that I think is cool, having been a magazine editor, is something we call the visual display of information. It's a long way of saying that he can connect science to art by figuring out ways to visually show something so that it's in many layers, like when you used to get the Encyclopedia Britannica and do the layers. That's the way his anatomy drawings are. And the skull drawing, for example, with the skin peeled off this side, but not so much on this side. You get to see where the sinuses are and how they work. If you look at this picture of my book and cover up one side, it doesn't really tell you that much. But when you have both sides put together that way, it's a perfect visual display of information, also on how the eye works. The other way he does visual display of information, seem to have lost this slide. I don't know, do we have a... Oh, well, the slide there is of a mola. It's a map. One of the cool things that they do, although hard to understand, is that, although we probably know people in this country right now who are collaborating with people they don't agree with, but he ends up becoming, working for Caesar Borgia, the warlord. And they're in a tiny town of Imola, and the third person with them for 4 months, holed up in this town, is Niccolo Machiavelli. And what Leonardo does in this slide, you can't see, is a beautiful aerial map of Imola. And so the visual display of information becomes a tool of war until Leonardo, who's a vegetarian and loves buying birds in cages so he can free them, decides, I'm not working for this warlord anymore. And he goes on back to Milan to paint The Last Supper. One of the things I want to emphasize on The Last Supper is something I said at the very beginning, which is this is a guy whose training came like right here on a stage. Every night he was staging performances, doing the perspective. If you imagine a play here, the scenery, it would come in a little bit too fast. It would be sort of an accelerated perspective to make the stage look deeper. If you put a table here and people are eating, the table would slant slightly so that you could actually see what was on the table. And even the actors might be all on one side of the table, and their gestures would be exaggerated, as if they were stage actors. And so we see that the theatrical training comes in well here, and once again, as in Adoration of the Magi, he makes it a narrative. This is not a moment in time. One of the great art critics said, the problem with this picture is it looks like it's a frozen moment. No, it doesn't. It looks like it's a drama, a narrative, beginning with Jesus saying, one of you shall betray me. And the sound going out here, they hear it first. They're already saying, is it me, Lord? The sound getting out here, they're trying to say, what did he say? What is this? They're figuring out as the waves go, and then the waves are bouncing back, and you even see Jesus' hands reaching forward and instituting the Eucharist, reaching for the wine and for the bread. And so you see in just a scene the dramatics of it, as well as the accelerated trick perspectives to make it look deeper. And if you ever go to the room and see it, it's even more amazing because the vantage point he does is sort of multiple, but a little bit off the ground. So it looks different from whatever way you're viewing it. And even what I loved here, which I noticed when I first walked in, there's a window in the refectory in the dining hall where he painted it. And you see the light, all of the light as if it's coming from that real window. The shadows, the light on the wall there. So it's sort of the genius of Leonardo. This painting was in San Francisco up until the day before yesterday. You may have read about it. I don't know. Any of you heard about it? Yeah. So Salvador Mundi is a painting that 20, 30 years ago people thought was just a it was a copy. It was badly restored. It was hard to see. A copy of what we knew was a Leonardo da Vinci painting of Salvador Mundi. Savior of the world. But it was sold for, I'm sure you've read about it in the papers, like $200 a couple of decades ago. But people who bought it eventually set out to prove that it was the original Leonardo. The good thing is we have many ways besides just pure connoisseurship now of doing it, including looking at the pentimenti, the underdrawings of the thumb, how it moved, to show it was done. He moved to 3 or 4 different places, something a copyist would not have done. And now it's been totally authenticated and is going to be put up for sale at Christie's November 15th, I think it is. And they have a minimum of 100 million, but I'm sure this will go for 150 or, people say, well, that's a lot. Trust me, I know people in this city who have spent more on sailboats. And if this is the only Leonardo da Vinci in private hands, if I had $150 million, which I don't, I would clearly buy it instead of a sailboat, and I would put it on permanent display at the San Francisco Museum or someplace. And be a real patriot. It's now owned by a Russian fertilizer oligarch. So we need to have this painting back in America, and it's definitely affordable. Interesting thing, as I said, he blurs lines because he understands that we don't see sharp lines in nature. One of the reasons people wasn't sure it was truly Leonardo's is the hand is not very blurry. It's actually kind of sharp. He doesn't usually paint sharp lines. But I'll look in his notebooks at this time. This is later. He's back, Florence, Milan. He's now in his 40s and 50s. These are later drawings. He's studying optics and perspective. And besides the type of a perspective where you have vanishing points and the scenery goes back, he has what's called acuity perspective or sharpness perspective. And he says that at a certain point, if I'm looking at somebody in the audience, the lines are sort of blurry because of the way our eyes work, but there is a certain point where something's about this far away where the lines are as sharp as they're going to be because of the way our eyes focus. And so it makes it seem like this hand is actually coming out of the painting and is closer to us than the head and face of Jesus. And it's like it's moving, and he's blessing us. And so I think that's the reason he did it. The other scientific mystery, which has thrown me in the news a little bit, because I wrote about this in my book, not knowing the painting would go on sale, is this is a crystal orb. But there's something very strange about the orb. He clearly knows about crystal orbs because he gets the 3 inclusions that are scientifically perfect. He's working for Isabella d'Este, trying to buy crystal for her. He's doing his optics experiments, and yet, if you've ever looked at a crystal orb, or for that matter, just one of those things you buy at a souvenir shop that has, the Transamerica building inside with snow coming on it, or whatever they have, you know that a solid orb, clear solid orb, will distort what's behind it, even reverse what's behind it. Things will look, and yet, Jesus' robes are totally not distorted. The theory, when I first pointed this out to people, said, oh, he probably just didn't know. And I'm saying, no, he knew. I mean, he's doing optics. He is making lenses. He is, even to do the copper dome, ball in the dome when he was a teenager, he's using concave mirrors and knows how that light works. I finally decided that it may have been because he knew it would distort, but if he had painted the folds of the robe sort of half upside down and distorted, it would have so messed up the picture. It would have been so distracting. He just decides, for the beauty of the picture, don't do it, just like he does certain tricks of perspective in The Last Supper, just because it makes the picture look better. But there's also another theory I have I'm playing with, and I also let the reader decide in the book. I talk about it. Is maybe he knows, and maybe he knows that a few people will know that it should have distorted, but he's subtly trying to convey the miraculous quality of Salvador Mundi, and that nothing that Jesus does with this earth distorts it. And so it's supposed to seem like a miracle. I'll let everybody else decide. One of the other interesting things around this time, this is 1503, as I say, he was about to hit 50, 51 years old. He's doing Salvador Mundi. This is, of course, Michelangelo. You can imagine the rivalry when a slightly younger Michelangelo becomes a new hot artist in Florence and does this enormous statue of David, Leonardo gets put on the committee to decide where it should be put. As you can imagine, Leonardo, who is friendly and loves things, but Michelangelo is very reclusive, has dissed in public Leonardo a couple of times, has been rude to him. Leonardo's on the committee and decides they should put it what is now those arches on the Uffizi. Stick it away where it won't be too prominent, is what he says. And this is from Leonardo's notebook. He even says we should put a decent ornament, decente ornamente, meaning a fig leaf, because the genitals are too prominent. For the first 40 years, the display of David had a bronze fig leaf because Leonardo asked for it. You can see their difference in styles, the sort of blurred lines called sfumato of Leonardo, and Michelangelo paints like a sculptor with very sharp lines. Even people in the distance have sharp lines, which Leonardo thought was deeply unsophisticated. But at this point, again, Leonardo once again says, okay, I'm not going to be an artist. This is bugging me. And he goes back to a lot of his anatomy work. And one of the things that I find interesting is those swirls of water that he loves, and he keeps observing everything from how water flows into a pond. He dissects the human heart and discovers the heart valve opening and shutting. Up until then, and even later, people thought a heart valve opened and shut because the blood pushes out of the heart into the ventricle and pushes it open, and the pressure pushes it down. And Leonardo says, no, it would crumple if that happened. And he realizes that the swirling of the blood, because blood going from a larger container to a smaller container forms swirls that brings a membrane out. And he even devises glass, chambers in which you can experiment with little grass seeds in it to show the swirls and to show how a heart valve would work. This was only proven 20 years ago when they finally did with iodine and MRIs a way of showing how the membrane gets pulled out, and Leonardo was exactly right. The thing about it, too, that I love is that page after page of his notebooks and mirror script, doing the heart, and he at one point draws the heart, and you can see he gets a little bit distracted. He's tired, he's bored, he's done a lot of heart drawings, so he sketches Salai around the heart, which I find somewhat romantic and endearing. And over again, we see both the beauty and the science being connected. And this is sort of an idealized portrait of an older version of himself, still looking at water flowing into ponds, how the swirls are made, what happens when a river gets diverted. And he does everything from the heart valve to he and Machiavelli try to come up with a plan to divert the Arno River so that Florence, this is right after 1492. It's actually 1494 when, guess what? A lot of reports are coming back about Columbus and then Amerigo Vespucci, who was a friend of Leonardo's. His cousin was one of Leonardo's best friends. They realized, hey, this is an age of exploration. Florence has got to be a seaport. We got to kind of mess up Pisa by getting the river to go right from us to the Mediterranean and skipping Pisa. So he does diversions of rivers, all sorts of things. But he does something so simple that I now try to do it every morning, which is when he looks at water flowing into a bowl, he figures out the swirls and what they look like, and he observes them for a while and writes about it. Something you and I can do. We see water flowing into a bowl all the time. We don't pause to observe it the way he does. And it all culminates, as I promised you it would, with the Mona Lisa. Remember Jenever De Benjy? He's now done all of these things. He's going to, again, paint a cloth merchant's wife in 3/4 profile. But among the science he's done is things like the optics experiments where he's dissected the human eye and discovers that something that comes and hits the very center of the retina, and if there's any opticians here or ophthalmologists, they would know, the cones and rods at the center see detail. And then the edges of the retina see shadows and colors better. And so he understands how that works. He also spends enormous amounts of time, page after page, dissecting the human lips, understanding that the bottom lip is a muscle. If you try it, you can move your bottom lip alone. You can move both lips together because the bottom lip is a muscle, but you can't thrust out your top lip alone because it's not a muscle. So he figures out every single muscle and the nerves connecting to every single muscle on how the lips work. And this is one of the final pages of his dissection of the human face drawings. And you see him take up another piece of chalk, a different type of thing, not a pen, light chalk. And this is the first sketch in 1503 of what will become the world's most famous smile. If there's any symbol or any direct evidence of science connecting to art, we see it with that smile hovering on top of the page. And so you get to the Mona Lisa. There's many things I could talk about because once again we've got the rivers that are flowing into from the eons of eternity down to civilization where they come roads and flowing into the veins of the human, the connection of us to our environment, of us to our nature, of us to earth, the eyes, everything about her is amazing. But I'm going to focus just on the smile. Because we've seen the dissections of the human lips. We've seen all those things he's done. And if you look at that smile, you see how anatomically perfect the top and the bottom lip are. But the amazing thing is that if you look right in the corner of the lips, there are tiny details. And I got to see the Mona Lisa on the day the museum is closed, where you can actually get up close and see it. But you can do it with a high-resolution image, or even in my book, I said, I'm going to get this in high resolution. The tiniest of details on the lips go down. If you look really closely right here, she doesn't look like she's smiling. So if you're staring directly at her, that's the part of the retina that's seeing the detail. But the shadows and the colors move up a bit. So if you stare directly at her smile, it's elusive. The more you look for the smile, the less you might see it. But as your eye just kind of wanders to her cheek or to her chin or forehead, just a little bit, the light comes in and catches a different part of your retina, and the smile flickers on. It's interactive. It's a virtual reality. It's elusive and mysterious. And it took him 13 years, starting in 1503, maybe 16 years, because it's by his deathbed in France. He's never given it sold it to the cloth merchant who commissioned it. As I said, he's not great at fulfilling his commissions, but it's partly because he just wants to keep things. And there is layer after layer, really almost 100 light brushstrokes, layers of glaze, sort of oil with tiny bits of pigment, as he gets the smile perfect, carries it from Florence to Milan to Rome, up to Pavia, and then across the Alps when Francis I invites him to France for his dying days. And that picture is there as he's making that most elusive of smiles. And it draws together everything he's done in his geology studies, everything he's done in his anatomical things, everything he's done in his scientific work, and even the mathematical proportions of a square and a circle. Everything is reflected in that painting, which is why this is the Mona Lisa, and the one he painted at the very beginning of his life was just Jenever De Benjy. He dies, he lives his final days here in this little manor house at Amboise with the young Francis I, the king, and we have his very last notebook page. Those of you who were here when I talked about Einstein, I did the same thing. I went to Hebrew University and I found the last page of his notebook. Einstein on his deathbed in Princeton, after the aorta had burst, he knew he wasn't going to make it, probably another night, but he gets his notebooks out and still writes 9 pages of equations to try to get us one step closer to the unified theory that will unify gravitational forces with the forces of quantum mechanics. Knowing it was his last days, he wasn't going to do it, but he thought it might get us one step closer to the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. And here we have Leonardo dying there on that bed, still trying to do the transformation of shapes, the squaring of the circle. The shaded area, Euclid had tried it with right triangles that have different length of legs, and shading the triangles in it as a way to help make shapes transform. And he even does a chart showing how it all works and how maybe this method will get him a step closer to squaring the circle. Even though he's dying, even though he's not going to make it, still trying to get a step closer to this eternal mystery. And the very last line, all of a sudden dribbles off a bit. He's explaining it, and then he pauses, and he says, "But the soup is getting cold." You imagine downstairs Maturin, his cook, and his students, and Melzi, his companion, and Salai and others, sitting there at the table downstairs in that wonderful house, waiting for Leonardo as he tries just one more time to square the circle, but the soup is getting cold. And so there he dies, arms in the King of France, and we have our Leonardo. Just one more thing. Wait, one more thing, as Steve Jobs would say. The tongue of the woodpecker is 3 times as long as the beak. It wraps around the brain so that when the woodpecker hits the bark at 10 times the force that would kill a human, it sort of cushions the brain. There's no reason you need to know that. It is totally useless information, just like it was no use to Leonardo. But I thought that maybe, after hearing that Leonardo put in his notebook, that you, like him, would want to know, just out of curiosity, pure curiosity. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
We have time for some questions, and if you missed some of the slides, I'll tell you, one thing Simon & Schuster did is they kept the price of this book the way a normal book would be, actually a little less than most biographies, but used this really high-quality paper, so you'll be able to see the elusive smile on it. Yes, sir?
Can you describe his experiment where he tried to use wings and fly in Fiesole?
Yeah, but wave and tell me where you are. Oh, there you are. Okay, you have a microphone. I get it. He, as I showed you with the helicopter, became interested in it for the theater and then decides he's going to make a man-powered flying machine. I have a whole bunch of chapters, a chapter in the book on it, and all the flying machines he did, they'd be human-powered. In Fiesole, he also tries gliders, which he does off of Mount Swan. The interesting thing is that, one of them looks like I have it in the book, looks like a health club torture chamber where you have to use your chest, your arms, your legs, your knees, everything to get the wings flap. It's impossible. We still haven't done it. You can't just have a machine in which a human can expend enough pressure and actually flap wings to take off. But every now and then, like squaring the circle or building a perpetual motion machine, which he tried, or building a flying machine, you have to try to accomplish the impossible. Steve Jobs did it and occasionally achieved what everybody said was impossible. But sometimes you don't achieve it. But even by trying and letting your reach exceed your grasp, you learn something about why it can't be done. So in Fiesole and others from the castle in Milan where he had his workshop, he finally creates a set of gliders, and the last thing he draws of a bird, looks like a flying machine, but also a bit like a bird. If you look at it carefully, it's on a guide wire, and I realized again that at the end of his life, he's doing it once again as a amusement for the theater, knowing that it can't be done in reality. But the attempt to make flying machines was one of his engineering passions, and some of the drawings are beautiful. They're all in the book. Thank you.
Next question on your left.
What was the research process like, and how do you determine historical accuracy?
Well, as I actually, in the book, to get to the second part of the question, say a whole lot of things about historical accuracy and how, like in Leonardo, there was somewhat of a blurry line between reality and mystery. Let's take this scene. This is the famous deathbed scene. Many paintings of it. We have, Vasari, who was a near contemporary, writes about Francis I cradling the head of his dear Leonardo as he dies. If you do a lot more research, you discover that the king had issued a proclamation from a town that was 2 days away and couldn't have been there. Then you do a little bit more research and you look at the chamber notes. He didn't sign that proclamation. His chamberlain did it. His prime minister's type did it. And the minutes of the council don't show whether the king was there. So we have a bit of mystery, but it's quite possible he was there cradling king. So from the very moment of his birth, was he born in that little cottage outside of Benjy that's known as Casa Natale, the birthplace? Did he die in the arms of the King of France? There are things we just don't know. By the way, I could take most of the 1990s, other things about Steve Jobs that he can't remember, and he'd go, when did I go to India? I can't quite remember. So things are blurry in our lives, Leonardo's life. We know more about Leonardo than we know about most people, because Steve Jobs, when I was dealing with him, in the 1990s, he had all these memos and emails on a Next computer. You may remember what a Next computer was. It was that beautiful thing he built in between his stints at Apple. Even with his tech people, he could not retrieve the document. The operating system, didn't. Paper is a great technology for the storage of information. 500 years later, we don't have to say, how do we make that operating system work? So I've got more documents by, 500-fold from Leonardo than we can get from a Steve Jobs. So I based the research mainly on these notebooks. In my book, because I've been at this long enough, I decided people like you might have that question. So I kind of open up the curtain and say, multiple times in the book, Salvador Mundi, anything. Here's the mystery. Here's the evidence. Why was the orb this way? Where was he born? Did he really try to do the flying machine off of Mount Swan? I say, here's my best judgment. Here's what some of the other evidence is. And I say, this is the way history works. We try to fill in the pieces, but the lines are always a little bit blurry.
The next question is right here in the front.
Hi. So if he was asked, and there was only one choice, if he was asked if he wanted to be remembered as an artist or a scientist, what would he say, do you think?
I'm going to give a little story, but I'll get to the answer. I asked that question of Martin Clayton, who is the curator at Windsor Castle of all the anatomy drawings. And he was showing me the deluge drawings, which are these, which is, you talk about him really caring about spirals and wind circles. So I said to him, Martin, do you think he would have thought of this as a work of art or a work of science? And as only a haughty curator at the Queen's Castle could have done, he raised himself to his full 5'3" height and said, I do not think Leonardo would have made a distinction between art and science. And in some ways, for Leonardo, the beauty of a piece of engineering or an equation was the same as the beauty of a brushstroke. They were both nature's way of painting something in reality. To get to a less romantic answer to your question, he was an artist more than he was an engineer. Even though he kept saying he was an engineer and artist, like to think of himself as an engineer. I love his engineering stuff. Had he not painted his paintings, nobody would remember his engineering. They would have remembered his anatomical science, they would have remembered the heart valve, they would have remembered some of the hydraulics. But as much as he liked to think of himself as an engineer and insisted with the King of France that he become both the engineer and the artist to the King of France, and he designs, a whole new city for him, he doesn't make this any distinction between science and art, but in the end, he's remembered for his art. I'm sorry that wasn't a one-word answer, but I tried to get there.
Next question up here on the left.
Hey there. First of all, I'm a Tulane alum, so it's cool to have you.
Roll Green Wave.
That's right.
Tulane is now doing a really dumb thing, which is playing LSU in football for a charity to fundraise for Puerto Rico. Now, this is obviously a good thing, except for I grew up remembering 63-0 football games where LSU continually creamed Tulane.
So Warren Buffett famously talks about this concept of the ovarian lottery and how he...
I'm sorry, Mark Zuckerberg's concept?
No, Warren Buffett.
Oh.
He talks about this concept of winning the ovarian lottery,
Correct.
that he was born in the 20th century and became a money manager.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been very topical if he was born in the 1500s. So I'm just
Right.
curious, have you ever thought about Jobs or Einstein or Da Vinci? What would their lives have been had they swapped places in time?
Right, and I actually do that a bit. I mean, here I'll go back to Florence to make the point. Leonardo would not have been Leonardo had he not been born in 1452, outside of Florence and going there. There would have been a difference if he had been different places. In 1452, besides Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and all being born, Gutenberg opens his first print shop, so an unlettered, unschooled kid from a village who couldn't go to school starts buying books. In his notebooks of Leonardo, we see, find the Euclid that's been translated and is now for sale at the stationers by the bridge. All of these things. So this is a perfect place for Leonardo to be born. Just as Steve Jobs, it was perfect for him 500 years later to get to the Bay Area, where he could be dropping acid into the homebrew computer club, yet also running into Intel engineers explaining how circuits work. So there are times and places, a great book called The Geography of Genius, which I can't remember who wrote it, but I loved reading it, talks about 12 places, Florence in 1470 being one, the Bay Area in 1970 being one, and a few other times in history where you have the right mix. Had Leonardo been born, to answer the second part of your question, say in 1970 instead of 1470, I think he would have flourished just as well. He had to be in a place that was tolerant, because he was as Steve Jobs would say, here's to the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs and the square holes, the ones who think different. That's who he was. He also had to be in a place where somebody like Gutenberg had just invented the print shop. And obviously in 1970, when the internet starts coming into fruition, that is to our time what Gutenberg was to 1470, which is anybody, anywhere can learn anything about whatever they're curious about and share their ideas with whomever they want. So the printing press and the internet are in some ways very similar in that regard. And the tolerance that you found in San Francisco in the Bay Area was similar to the tolerance you found in Florence. So I do think Leonardo would have done just fine in, had he been born in the Bay Area and grown up at the same time as Steve Jobs. But he would have been really, really in bad shape had he grown up, say, in the 1950s in a place that was more repressive and didn't like outsiders and misfits and people who were different and stressed conformity, and you had to learn by rote. I do think the geography of genius, your question is so interesting because I also explore it with Einstein, being born Jewish in Germany, the turn of the century, feeling like a real outsider and persecuted, but also having the advantages of being in an incredibly well-educated, smart family. So the time and the place are always very interesting to me. And you'll see there's a whole section in Florence in this book that compares it a bit to other great times like that. And in my Innovators and Steve Jobs book, I do the same for Silicon Valley. Yeah.
The
I
next
see a
question is
hand
up
in the
on
middle,
your
but-
right over here.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So
Yeah.
first off, thanks for your work. It's great. Second, other than the relationship between science and art for Leonardo, what was a commonality that you found in him compared to the other people you
Yeah.
did biographies on that you didn't necessarily know going in?
I do think thinking differently, thinking out of the box, being a rebel who questions authority is something that's common through most geniuses, certainly the ones I've written about. Leonardo is the beginning of really the scientific method. He's told something and he says, how do we know that? He's told that the biblical story of the flood, and that's how all fossils are done, whatever. He studies layer after layer of fossils and says, no, the biblical flood never happened. These things came thousands of years apart in different sedimentary layers. That fetus in the womb I told you about, he studies whether or not it's viable, whether it could breathe, whether it could eat out of the womb, and questions whether it has a soul. I mean, that's a pretty modern bit of heresy for you. So, likewise with Einstein, I mean, he's a patent clerk because he can't get a job teaching at a university because his ideas are so out of the box. But he's trying to look at devices to synchronize clocks, and they all send signals at the speed of light. He said, well, if I go to one clock really fast, would synchronize look different than if I'm going the other way. And he comes up with this notion that, okay, I get it, the speed of light is always constant, but time is relative, depending on your state of motion. Now, that's questioning the basic received wisdom of all of modern science, which is the first paragraph of Newton's Principia, saying time marches along second by second, irrespective of how we observe it. And you get a patent clerk saying, how would you test that? How would you know that? So every single one of them, Steve Jobs, Franklin, Einstein, Leonardo, they all are willing to question the received dogma of their period. I have a last chapter in my book, because this is really the culmination of these books. I'm not going to find another genius like Leonardo. And so the last chapter, which is a bit gimmicky, but I felt I should do it, is the 25 lessons I have learned, mainly about Leonardo, but how they relate to the other, being more observant than other people, questioning received wisdom, being open to mystery. So it's one of those, lessons from Leonardo, it's called.
Okay, we're going to take one last question, and I just want to remind everybody to join us immediately afterwards in the atrium. Walter Isaacson's going to be signing books, and I hope you can stick around for that.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed your books over the years. In addition to the geography of genius, and the fact, obviously, that geniuses are very intelligent, there are lots of really intelligent people. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if, based on current brain science, or even something like left-handedness, there is a pattern that we now know, or traits that we now know that we can see through the centuries that we might not have otherwise seen. I'm thinking particularly of left-handedness, because it does make you see the world differently.
Yeah, Leonardo is indeed left-handed. And there are other syndromes that may connect with that. I mean, dyslexia a bit, but Leonardo's not dyslexic. He reads enormous numbers of complicated books. He's, a little bit ADD in some ways, because every time he sees something new and shiny, he leaves the adoration of the Magi behind or something. But he's also compulsive. I mean, I told you, 200 pages, drawings of squaring the circle, all those things you saw. It's almost OCD. I worry about us in modern times pulling down whatever it's called, the diagnostics manual or whatever, and saying, okay, he's this and he's that and the other thing, and we would have then put him on some pharmaceutical regimen, and we wouldn't have had the Mona Lisa. And it's kind of good that he was allowed to deal with his own demons and dragons and depressions and elations on his own. I do not know of a neurological pattern, whether it be left-handedness or right-brainedness or whatever. People took Einstein's brain after he died, and they sliced and diced it and sent it to centers around the world, and everybody's trying to figure out, why was this brain different? I don't know that we have yet stumbled across or found perfect neurological connections like that. And I actually believe is not just that you're born this way, and this is the deepest lesson, which I'll end with on this book. As I said, Leonardo willed his way to being the most creative genius in history. It wasn't like he was born with some neurological phenomenon. it's like he was a kid, and he kept asking himself questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do people yawn? Why does a swirl happen when you flow water into a bowl? All these things we probably wondered about when we were 10, before we outgrew our wonder years. They're probably questions that our kids or grandkids or nephews or nieces keep asking, and somehow or another, we pull that curiosity out of them at times. The thing that Leonardo teaches us, it's not that you have to be born this way. You can just decide you're going to look at the wings of the bird when it takes off one morning. Or you're going to watch the water coming into the sink. Or you're going to look at the dragonfly. And you're even going to wonder and look up, the way I finally did after laughing about it, what a tongue of a woodpecker looks like. And I wrote this book because we can all be a little bit more like Leonardo and not say, oh, he was just born a genius, I could never be that way. Thank you all very much.